something a little bit different today because of what LaRouche is saying and about the crisis that the nation is in and about the question of people finding the passion and the courage to actually fight in a way that's going to be victorious. Because history is filled with defeats where maybe people haven't agreed with what's going on, but they don't fight to win. And the reason people don't fight largely is not because they're committed to an evil result, but because they're afraid of the opinions of their friends or what's on television in the case of our society. So I think the story of this young soccer player, in a sense, really gets at that, because you can imagine the pressure on him from his team, his family, and everyone else. What, are you crazy? You're famous, you're making money, and you're going to go sit in the square with a bunch of homeless people? I mean, anyway, so it's critical, and I think we have to remind ourselves, while it's scary to look at, what happened on, I guess 2 weeks ago, on Monday and Tuesday, was that for the first time you had an explicitly fascist coup in the United States. That is, Standard & Poor's and Moody's said you have to impose a certain amount of cuts. And by the way, it's not $4 trillion. What they're demanding is $11 trillion. So if you don't think that the intent is mass murder, it's $11 trillion in cuts, and they're not talking about cuts from Goldman Sachs or Bank of America. Okay? And what occurred? Rather than standing up and fight, rather than doing what LaRouche and the six of us, the slate, have been saying, they rolled over. And Obama said, what we're going to do is we're going to establish a committee, like what Hitler did when he got the German parliament to dissolve itself and give him dictatorial powers. What you had is the House and Senate vote to give up their elected representative authority and choose 12 people who are going to impose the cuts. And you remember, for people that weren't here last year, didn't hear, the deal is they're going to come up with the first, it's like a down payment, $1.5 trillion in cuts. And they're going to come up with some package which is cuts from defense, Social Security, and Medicare. Then this goes to the full Congress for a vote. There can be no debate, no filibuster. They either vote yay or nay. If they vote nay, the cuts go through anyway. It'll be 2% across the board. It might not be the configuration of the committee, but it'll be 2% because Great Britain's lackeys, the British Empire's banking system, demands that we do this. So that's what occurred 2 weeks ago. There was a coup in the United States, like what Hitler did when he had his own people burn down the parliament, and they gave away their power to a dictatorship. And a few weeks ago, I and a couple of the other candidates for Congress were down in Virginia, and we had a series of meetings with Mr. LaRouche, which were extremely intense. He, as people may know, is about to turn 89. He's a World War II veteran. And he was somewhat anguished because he said, you know, there's certain experiences that I've had as a veteran that younger people have not had. And normally there are things that I think about that I try to shield people from. But we're getting to a point, a crisis, where I cannot shield you because you have to be prepared to handle what is coming. And somewhat surprisingly, he said that one of the critical sources of passion in war was the question of love. And he talked about the love, for example, among soldiers in combat, or a particular experience that he had in Burma where there were soldiers in intensive care and they didn't have the right equipment to save the lives of these guys. And he was absolutely beside himself because he knew had they been in the United States that their lives could be saved. So what he did was he simply didn't sleep. When he was on shift, because it had to do with oxygen and so on, he just stayed up because he was so determined that these people had to live, that he kept held everything in place by hand. And then his shift ended, and some other soldiers came in, and the next morning all 4 soldiers were dead. And you don't know if they would have lived or died regardless, but the kind of anguish and also the frustration that others maybe didn't have the equal passion that he did for his comrades. So you can imagine, this kind of thing is extremely intense, and there's a certain kind of passion which you see, unfortunately, sadly, lacking, which is why people don't find within themselves the courage to stand up against something as simple as popular opinion. Today, people are simply afraid of being laughed at, or afraid of being called a name, or you're afraid that someone would say you're crazy. I mean, we're living in a country where people are snorting cocaine and day trading and making trillions of dollars, and we're afraid of being called insane. I mean, you really have to wonder about that. So what I wanted to revisit was a little bit of what I took up last week, which was this question of what distinguishes human beings from the animals. And yeah, you can see that. This is a chart of population growth. And you can see for many, many years, up to like 1500 AD, the population of human beings barely increased at all. And then you began to get certain breakthroughs in science. Fire, energy, steam engines, rail, and what you see is that the population simply skyrockets. But there's another aspect of that, which is not like deer or bears, which if their population skyrockets, they start eating babies. They come into the towns, or the deer starve, they eat all the trees, and then they all starve to death. If you have an animal which has a burst in population, it depletes its resources, and the standard of living drops. With human beings, I can say with great certainty that the standard of living of people today is a heck of a lot higher than it was in 5000 BC. Okay, so not only do we have more people, but the standard of living of each person, as a result, frankly, of this division of labor, of this complex economy we've built, the standard of living is much higher. And that's because human beings have a capacity to actually think of the future and to think outside of their own physical, here's what I'm doing in the here and now. You can know things from the past, you can plan for the future, and the future is changed by things that occurred in the past. And things that occurred in the past are changed in their nature by what we do in the future, and that is unique to human beings. And you can measure it empirically. And this is really LaRouche's area of expertise, is the question of the intelligibility of human creativity. That it's not arbitrary. Being a genius is not like a block, some kind of bump that's on the back of your neck. You're either born with it or you're not. Okay, that's not human nature. The nature of a human being is that every single human being, short of certain real biological infirmities, has a potential for genius. And our United States actually used to be premised on that idea. That's what's in the Declaration of Independence. So, next. LaRouche had this quote, which I like using because the first time I read it, I had to read it about 15 times, and it was really hard to get. But it gets at the question of Alexander Hamilton and the question of credit. He says, the presumption is that the usefulness of the output of production as measured in terms of the consumption which is temporarily withheld in the name of physically efficient credit, okay, can be foreseen with a sufficiently good approximation that the net result, as measured in terms of physical usefulness, is greater than the amount of consumption which is postponed in the name of credit. So in the sense of credit, we have used before this example of what if you had $1? Well, you could just spend it right now, and you might get half of a protein bar, and then you would eat it, and that would be over. Or you could say you're going to lend your $1 to a farmer who's going to plant a crop, buy a bunch of corn seeds and grow a whole bunch of corn, and maybe he gets a few bushels. And then he not only can repay you, but has produced enough corn that's maybe worth $20 or $30 or $40. So that by withholding the consumption in the present and planning for the future, you actually multiply the value of whatever it is you have in the present. And that was Alexander Hamilton's conception. That's why debt, in and of itself, is not a bad thing. And Hamilton said debt is a blessing. Because if it's a debt which is created because of a plan for a future development, then it's not really a debt, it's a credit or something else. Very important. And this was the idea of the United States and our system of credit. And unfortunately, no one teaches that anywhere today. All the universities are really stupid. They either teach you the British free trade system, buy cheap, sell dear, the invisible hand, the magic of the marketplace, the law of supply and demand, all this crap. And then on the other side, you're a communist. And actually, both of those assume the same physical value for physical things, whereas they're just different sides of the same coin. Whereas the American system, the reason we were such a threat, our little republic, was because of this conception of credit. And that's why after 100 years, only 100 years of existing, we were the most industrial productive nation on the planet. But it's interesting, speaking of the sphere thing, it was such a controversy that we had defeated the British Empire that no head of state dared to be seen with us. They would not visit us. No heads of state came to the United States until the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. Not a one. No head of state dared to come over here and be seen because they didn't want to offend the British Empire because they weren't sure that the Brits would once again get the upper hand. And the first head of state to come was the Emperor of Brazil. So, kind of interesting. Anyway, so I thought the question, what we should look up is what the German, the question is, okay, can we educate ourselves to be courageous? Can we change our identity to be truthful, courageous people? Because that's the question, because that's what the survival of civilization is going to depend on. And luckily, there was a German poet, Friedrich Schiller, who dedicated his life and all of his writings to this question. He wrote, in fact, a whole series of lectures on the aesthetical education of man. And he wrote one, which I'm not going to go through in its entirety, but on the Sublime, which is a very, very profound short essay. And later in the essay, but I think it's useful to start with, he talks about the difference between a beautiful soul and someone who is sublime. And he says, suppose you had a man who is well-to-do, but in spite of being well-to-do, he's actually a good person. He's generous, he's cheerful, he always helps his friends when they're in trouble, he loves justice, he stands up for righteousness, and so he said, how could anyone not love such a person? That's a beautiful soul, that's a good person. But he said, now what happens if this same person is robbed, beaten till he's crippled, loses everything, loses all his money, loses his loved ones, is racked with pain and bedridden, and he retains his personality, that he's still cheerful, he's still just, he's still kind, that he'll sacrifice, he'll do things even though he's in pain to help someone else. He said that is the quality of the sublime. And the sublime is always it's a conflict, because it's something suffering which is wrenching, and then it's the power of the person to overcome that. So Schiller begins this paper, and I'm just going to read you a little bit of the beginning so you can think about it, because this is a challenge. He starts by saying, no man must. That is, no man has to do something. Must. Said Nathan the Jew to the dervish. And this expression is true to a greater extent than one perhaps would like to admit. The will is the species character of man, and reason itself is the eternal law of the will. The entirety of nature acts according to reason. Man's prerogative is simply that he act according to reason with consciousness and will. All other things must. Man is the creature who wills. Just for this reason is nothing more unworthy of man than to suffer violence. For violence annuls him, right? Violence, someone imposes their will against your will. One who lays violent hands on us disputes nothing less than humanity. One who suffers violence in a cowardly manner throws his humanity away. But this claim to absolute liberation from all that is violence seems to hypothesize a being who possesses enough force to repel every other force from himself. If this claim to absolute liberation from all violence is found in a being who doesn't hold the highest rank in the realm of powers, an unhappy contradiction arises between his aspiration and his capacity. That is, how can you be a free person if you don't have the physical power to overwhelm everything that would possibly force itself upon you? And this is the question which Schiller raises, and he said, so what about the question of death? Can anyone escape death? And if you can't escape death, does that mean that you are not human, that your free will has been taken away from you? And the question is actually converting something that's done against you into an act of your own will, which again is the sublime. That you know you have to face something horrible, so you accept it and it becomes your own act. And so what I wanted to do from that standpoint is just show this, which I've shown before, but it's Martin Luther King on his speech just before he is assassinated, when it's very clear that he knows he's going to be assassinated. And you can see him really making the decision in the course of the speech in a certain sense.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I don't think any of us can be satisfied in the United
Anyway, so it's very clear. Now, Martin Luther King considered himself a Christian. And the founder of Christianity, Christ, also was clearly of the Sublime. You see King's expression exactly as Christ himself expressed it and has been taken up. And what I wanted to do was, we're going to look at a little bit of the Passion according to St. John as set by Bach. And there's an aria which is sung by an alto, and then the theme of that aria is later taken up and set by Beethoven in a piano sonata. And a lot of people have missed this because the piano sonata doesn't have words. So you wouldn't say, oh yeah, it's obvious, there's Bach. And Beethoven also had a certain quality of this incredible sublime nature, and I think everything you hear, and you'll hear it when we listen to the two examples, but you hear the melancholy and you always hear Beethoven triumph. His music is always victorious by the end of it. There's nothing that is really happier than to hear Beethoven. So what I wanted right now is actually for Dennis, before we go to that, to read this statement from Beethoven, and it speaks for itself, which he wrote in 1802. He was born in 1770, so he was only 32 years old. And you can just think about it, what he's saying in this.
Can you respond?
Can they hear you?
I think so.
Face that way, the camera wants you.
Face that way?
Or you can stand up.
Yeah, where are the solutions?
Yeah, so it's podium.
Okay, so this is the Heiligenstadt Testament. For my brothers Karl and Johann Beethoven. O you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was even inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now, I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year, deceived with hopes of improvement, and finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was soon compelled to isolate myself, to live life alone. If at times I tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly was I flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it was impossible for me to say to people, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." Or how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or ever have enjoyed? Oh, I cannot do it. Therefore, forgive me when you see me draw back, when I would have gladly mingled with you. My misfortune is doubly painful to me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. I must live almost alone, like one who has been banished. I can mix with society only as much as true necessity demands. If I approach nearer to people, a hot terror seizes upon me, and I fear being exposed to the danger that my condition might be noticed. Thus it has been during the last 6 months which I have spent in the country. By ordering me to spare my hearing as much as possible, my intelligent doctor almost fell in with my own present frame of mind, though sometimes I ran counter to it by yielding to my desire for companionship. But what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone standing next to me heard a shepherd singing, and again, I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that, and it would have ended my life. I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. Oh, it seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had forth all that I felt was within me. So I endured this wretched existence, truly wretched for so susceptible a body, which can be thrown by a sudden change from the best condition to the worst. Patience, they say, is what I must now choose for my guide, and I have done so. I hope my determination will remain firm to endure until it pleases the inexorable to God, I think, means to break, a parquet, he says, to break the thread. Perhaps I shall get better, perhaps not. I am ready. Forced to become a philosopher already in my 28th year. Oh, it is not easy, and for the artist, much more difficult than for anyone else. Divine One, thou seest my inmost soul. Thou knowest that therein dwells the love of mankind and the desire to do good. O fellow men, when at some point you read this, consider then that you have done me injustice. Someone who has had misfortune may console himself to find a similar case to his, who, despite all the limitations of nature, nevertheless did everything within his powers to become accepted among worthy artists and men. You, my brothers Carl and Johann, as soon as I am dead, if Dr. Schmidt is still alive, ask him in my name to describe my malady and attach this written document to his account of my illness, so that, so far as it is possible, at least the world may become reconciled to me after my death. At the same time, I declare you two to be the heirs to my small fortune, if so it can be called. Divide it fairly, bear with and help each other. What injury you have done me, you know was long forgiven. To you, Brother Carl, I give special thanks for the attachment you have shown me of late. It is my wish that you may have a better and freer life than I have had. Recommend virtue to your children. It alone, not money, can make them happy. I speak from experience. This was what upheld me in time of misery. Thanks for it, and to my art, I did not end my life by suicide. Farewell, and love each other. I thank all my friends, particularly Prince Linchowski and Professor Schmidt. I would like the instruments from Prince L to be preserved by one of you, but not to be the cause of strife between you. And as soon as they can serve you a better purpose, then sell them. How happy I shall be if I can still be helpful to you in my grave. So be it. With joy I hasten toward death. If it comes before I have had the chance to develop all my artistic capabilities, capacities, it will still be coming too soon, despite my harsh fate. And I should probably wish it later. Yet even so, I should be happy, for would it not free me from the state of endless suffering? Come when thou wilt, I shall meet thee bravely. Farewell, and do not wholly forget me when I am dead. I deserve this from you, for during my lifetime, I was thinking of you often and of ways to make you happy. Be so. Ludwig van Beethoven, Heiligenstadt, October 6, 1802.
So, and he lived another 25 years, dead, writing his music death. And that was one of the big slanders of him, by the way, his late string quartets. People said, well, he was deaf, he didn't know what he was writing. Anyway, so let's do the Bach. Now you're going to have to listen. Okay, so I'm just going to read the script till we get to the music. This is from John. The evangelist says, the soldiers, having crucified Jesus, took possession of his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier, leaving out the tunic. The tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let's not cut it up, but toss it to see whose it shall be. So that the scripture would be fulfilled, which says, they shared my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. That is what the soldiers did. Near the cross where Jesus hung stood his mother with his sister Mary, wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. Now when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, Woman, behold, this is your son. And after that he said to the disciple, Behold, this is your mother. And then the choir says, he thought of everything in his last hour. Still considerate of his mother, he assigned her a guardian. Humankind, you too should act rightly, love God and fellow humans, and then die without any sorrow, and do not let yourself be troubled. And from that moment, the disciple took her under his care. After that, Jesus, aware that all had now been accomplished, said in fulfillment of the scripture, I thirst. A jar stood there full of sour wine. So they soaked up a sponge with the wine, set it upon a hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. Having received the wine, he said, it is accomplished. Es ist vollbracht. And he died. Okay, and this is the aria, and we're going to hear a performance. I'll read the English words first, which are not, the English that's here is not the same translation as Marian Anderson sings. She sings it in English with slightly different words. She says, it is fulfilled. It is accomplished, it is fulfilled. What comfort for afflicted souls. The night of mourning now marks the final hour. The hero from Judah triumphs with power. And I think the translation, he fought the fight. That is, Christ is heroic in his death and fulfilling the scripture. and brings the battle to a close, it is accomplished. So you can just listen.
Oh
right, between the triumphant part and the idea. I just want to hear a snip of the beginning again, because I want the theme to be in your mind so you can recognize it when we listen to the Beethoven. Remember that. Okay. It doesn't start in the Beethoven. You have to be awake to hear where it comes in, and then you'll hear the transition. And the Beethoven sense of victory, you'll really hear actually is definitely, it's superior to Bach. He's after Bach, he learned from Bach, and you really get a sense of a total victory by the way he develops this. Anyway, so it's that great.
Who is the piano solo?
Rudolph Serkin. Yeah.
Oh,
Anyway, so I just wanted to say in closing, because when we met with Mr. LaRouche and we were discussing these questions, and Keisha asked about, well, the question of immortality and what makes us immortal and what do we do? And she said, well, what happens if a child dies? A child who doesn't have a chance to contribute anything. And what Lynn said is that the child is immortal because of the love of the parents for the child. And then I think similarly with people who die suddenly. And he said to us that this is the question, you have to love the dead. To love the dead. And it's from there, obviously, that you will find the passion to fight for civilization. If you can come up with that quality of love for mankind, because what do you love in an individual, especially an individual that you never met? But it's the love of mankind. And I would say that is what's so evil about the environmentalist movement. Why we can always defeat them, because they hate mankind. Their view of man is that human beings are a cancerous blight on the planet, and there should be less of us. So, at any rate, that's what I wanted to present. I hope it's been provocative, and we can take questions.